welcome to this, the third in this little Now and Then series on travels and poetry. On our first two trips, we went to some of the far corners of the earth. Today we'll be a little closer to home. I've called this program Meandering the American West. I almost called it Gawking at or Gaping at the West, because this part of our nation is so vast. The mountains are so high, the canyons so deep, the rivers so powerful, and the vistas so amazingly beautiful. So, you can gape and gawk all you want while we are meandering. As often happens in history, most of our western land came to us at someone else's expense. In the case of the Louisiana Purchase, it was Napoleon's financial woes that gave President Jefferson the opportunity to buy this very large tract of land. It was a piece of land Jefferson had never seen and would never see. Land transfer of 1803. The Emperor Napoleon had flamboyant plans. Already armed with African minions tending his Caribbean sugar lands, he set his sights on the mainland delta and far beyond as the next expansion of his empire. But his self-indulgent dreams soured. Slave revolts and financial stress at home turned his imagined dominion to vinegar. Desperate, he put France's vast American holdings on the auction block. President Jefferson seized the offer. On the nation's behalf, he invested a mere 3 pennies an acre for the immense parcel, later dubbed the Great Plains. One man's ascetic vision became a nation's sweet breadbasket. Having acquired this land, Jefferson wanted to know its exact borders. The Mississippi River was an obvious boundary on the eastern side, except at its source. It seems nobody in Washington, D.C. knew where that was. Jefferson sent several surveyors to the Northland to get some answers, but they came back either empty-handed or, as it turned out later, with the wrong information. Then a Mr. Schoolcraft, operating on his own, thought to himself, I wonder what would happen if I just asked somebody who lives up there. He found an Ojibwe chief who said, oh yes, you just go up this trail, turn left at the Big Oak, and so on. And following these very good directions, our Mr. Schoolcraft soon found himself standing on the shores of Lake Itasca, the true source of the Mississippi River. We're going there at the end of a long, dry summer. The water is just dribbling over the edge of the lake, down a few feet, and into a little mud gully no more than a yard or so wide. Other tourists are jumping back and forth across the little stepping stones, and they can't wait to get home to tell everyone they know, I walked across the Mississippi River. A wee beginning. We gather wordlessly to stare at the puny brooklet forming just below shimmering Lake Itasca. The water dribbles through accommodating reeds and falls gracelessly to the gully below. Disbelieving adults and naive children sprint easily across the yard-wide expanse, landing lightly on the handful of smooth stones that bridge the Lilliput waterway. How can this dripping faucet be known as the mighty Mississippi? While we are in Minnesota, we meet many residents who are descendants of immigrants from Northern Europe. intentional improvisation. In Minnesota, we are surrounded by tall people whose sentences end in midair and whose veins pulse happily in Arctic chill. We wonder why their immigrant ancestors, with so much America to choose from, picked the harshest place they could find. Perhaps it reminded them of the Northland they had turned their backs on. Perhaps they could close their eyes and imagine new opportunities and the old homestead as one. Traveling west a bit, we come to the Dakota Badlands. When we first hear that name, we probably think, well, there's a place I don't ever want to find myself in. But there's much more to the Badlands than an unattractive name. People have been living in this area for centuries, starting with the mammoth hunters. Recovering history. French trappers found these ridges daunting, cursed their 100-mile barrier, and spat out the name Badlands. Did they not see the soft sunset glow playing on a spectrum of pastels? Were they immune to the stunning array of serrated rock, blending into a natural Da Vinci? Were they not amazed at vigilant prairie dogs, agile pronghorns, and massive bison that shared this land? Could they not marvel at cliff swallows defying gravity with precarious nests? Had they no questions about the history embedded in 30-million-year-old layers of weathered stone? So be it. I will inhale the miraculous palate, laugh at animal antics, gape at swooping birds, and learn storied imprints in their place. The Federal Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to any adult who was willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. Within 40 years, over 600,000 claims had been filed for over 80 million acres. How's that for a big federal program? Imagine you are a pioneer who's just taken advantage of this offer. You've come from a place farther east that was heavily forested. When you wanted to build your home there, you just went into the forest, chopped down some trees. You had all the building materials you needed. But here, as you look around the prairie, there are a couple of little cottonwoods down by the stream, but that's it for timber. What are you going to do for shelter? Don't panic. There's a wonderful building material readily available, and it's right here at your feet. It's called sod. Building a sod house by the numbers. First, you plow 3 inches deep into the tightly tangled buffalo grass roots. Then cut ribbons of sod into 18-inch long sections. Stack the strips, grass side down, to produce an alternating brick-like pattern with small openings for window and door. Fasten layer upon layer, calculating your progress, until 3 walls measure 2 feet thick and tall man high, while being grateful for the hillside providing the 4th wall. Pour the strength of your hands, back, legs, and even breath into a symbol of your determination to succeed against all odds, enumerating each small addition with sweaty pride. In these earthen sanctuaries, sodbusters endured annual blizzards, swarming locusts, rampaging fires, buried children, fearsome loneliness, relentless wind, mounting debts, shoddy equipment, devastating drought, and sudden floods. Despite these towering obstacles, pioneer settlers made their mark across the American plains as resolute homesteaders, claiming the reluctant prairies as their own. Some declared defeat, but those who stayed discovered a tough core within themselves, an indomitable will to survive and be counted. It is true that some pioneer farmers did not make out so well. When the Great Plains opened for development, some Eastern entrepreneurs saw a great business opportunity. They agreed to sponsor people eager for a fresh start, usually recent immigrants with high hopes but empty pockets. They agreed to sponsor these people, set them up on a little claim, on the condition that they would get a fair percentage of the harvest profits. So these innocents set out, did all the work, and then when the crop was ripe, suddenly these businessmen would show up in their fancy suits carrying a little overnight bag. They would stay just long enough to supervise taking the crop to market, filling their pockets, and then they were gone till next year. Here's one man's sad story. Birch luck. Josiah Birch counts the anthill pile of creased dollars once again, then stacks small change into tiny hummocks on his table. It is not enough. It will never be enough to fuel the dream. Then the man with deep pockets and a snarky gleam in his eye holds out a pot of gold. Soon Josiah heads for Kansas, for fertile farmland, for a stake, for opportunity. He plows, weeds, and reaps through the prairie scorch, wearing sweat as his middle name. He hangs by a sliver of corn silk through tornado, locust, and drought, knowing lonesome firsthand. Suddenly the man appears, overnight bag in hand, ready to assess his harvest investment, the one made with not even a smidge of dirt. He takes his bloated profit and returns to his leisure. Josiah, having learned the gist of absentee ownership, spits through his glower. Suitcase farmer. He stomps inside his slip-slide shelter, counts his paltry share of the year's work. It is not enough. It will never be enough to fuel the dream. Even though some people did not make out well, I think we need to pay tribute to those who toughed it out in good times and bad. Ode to the Farmer. This comes from a city girl. Some see traveling the farmland plains as one impossibly boring endurance test. But I am drawn to their reassuring character, their forthright statement of faith. Work is always in sight, a field to plow, a fence to mend, a flock to feed. Farmers would sooner buy 10 more acres than purchase a new car. Their ties to the land so deeply entrenched, their lives so neatly entwined with the seasons. Survivors of drought, flood, and weevils, they continue to rise before dawn, perform the gritty tasks that fill the agenda, finding satisfaction in barnyard lingo. The house paint may be peeling, but the barn gleams with care. When rows of tiny sprouts greet daylight, the annual crop of hope surges from the soil. When we travel the Great Plains today, we may think everything looks just about the same for hours and days. That's when it's time to notice some of the small stuff. Midwest byways. We think we've gotten an early start, but the cows are already on second helpings. Fog pulls away from us on its own erratic terms, and morning light wins its daily battle to prevail. Mailboxes line the rural driveways, their sturdy flags standing at attention. Historical signs of great local interest remain unread by passing cars. Kansas seems to have run out of numbers, for the roads are named P, T, and CZ. Unlittered by skyscrapers and factories, the mundane becomes remarkable. Continuing west, we cross the state line into Colorado. We know that many of its towns and cities were established during the mining heyday. At one time, there were about 100 mines that extracted over $100 million worth of silver and then gold. We try to recapture a little of the flavor of those days by taking a train from Durango to Silverton. What remains of Silverton? There was a time when grubby miners hitched their dreams to a vein, a stream, a claim. At Durango, they had either flung themselves into a ramshackle carriage or backpacked by Shanksmere. Struggling up the mountain to Silverton, they crammed their heads with nugget visions to counteract the nightmare reality of empty pockets. Waving merrily to roadside gawkers, we travel quite comfortably on a coal-stoked train, hoping to recapture the essence of Colorado's mining heyday. We leave cottonwood and willow behind to gaze at pinyon and aspen, framed by cavernous gorges and lofty peaks. At our destination, we walk Silverton's dirt streets, while its few hundred residents pan for tourist gold at the Shady Lady Diner and Treasure Trove Trinket Shop. Nearby, the bubbling Animas River aerates its green waters, except when entering creeks deposit telltale orange leavings, the only true reminder of the glory days. Some pioneers made their way all the way across the plains, either through or around the Rocky Mountains, and found themselves in a little patch of ground today we call Utah. This is one family's experience, and it's based on a true story. To dream the impossible dream. With wide-eyed innocence, they persist across the prairie, around jagged mountain peaks, and into cheerless desert. Here they come, Elijah Behengen, his unnamed wife. Why does that description remind me of the Old Testament with its anonymous, nameless women, and 8 children with no say in the matter? They're just another family chasing Papa's ephemeral dreams, when a paltry stream, optimistically named Green River, quenches their thirst and makes them imagine this fool's mission might work after all. Elijah and the boys fashion a 2-bed wooden hut just beneath a looming rock face that shields them from the north wind. At night, the parents and the 2 in makeshift diapers sleep in relative peace inside this shelter. Outside, the girls huddle in the exhausted wagon beneath the tattered canopy that invites the weather, while the boys cram into the cliff's odd-shaped niches, trying to decide if this is the face of adventure or misery. They spend their days inventing a ditch to the waterway to irrigate the newly planted garden seeded with precious eastern grains of hope that have survived this torturous trek. 3 months in, the seasonal rains pelt their meager plot, surge down the indifferent precipice, decimate their sprouting beans, and flood them out. They cry, pack up, and move on, disappearing from our sight. But today, a century and more later, that little homestead site remains, a symbol of what they tried and the unquenchable pioneer quest. Today, when we go to Utah, it's hard to know which national parks to see first. They are all so beautiful. And it's great to look at the expansive vistas, but also to listen to a few small things. Backstage at Rainbow Point, Bryce Canyon National Park. Cheep, announces a pine siskin, tweeting its script as it darts to juniper greens. Sss, simmers a lusty locust while playing its cameo role, while it hides behind rock curtains. Silence, replies the quivering aspen, muting its lines. Let canyon cliffs take center stage. At Zion National Park, it seems every rock formation has been given an imaginative name. One of the most common formations is the stacks of rock like this that are all over the place. They're called hoodoos, which is a variation of a West African word for voodoo. Inspecting hoodoos at Zion National Park. Hoodoos, they are called, those stony, stacked columns, long since shorn from the mother cliff, standing aloof, accompanied by the robed bishop, the pioneer girl, the gritty miner, the ironclad warship. Linked to voodoo by more than rhyme, they spook the ancients, but enchant us now, as we gaze spellbound, watching from Zion's cement viewpoint for 10 million years in a lusty wind to dissolve their ephemeral lives. Now we're going to head down to Texas. We can hardly believe how flat the land is. As we're driving along, we start to see these great big cracks in the surface of the land. And the cracks keep getting bigger and bigger. And finally, there's an opening so wide, we can just turn right into it and go down the windy road to a canyon. This is no little dip in the land. We are in Palo Duro Canyon, the second largest canyon in the United States. It's 120 miles long and about 800 feet deep. We settle into our campsites, relax a little, and then head to tonight's outdoor drama. The beneath of Palo Duro Canyon. The land could not be any flatter if it were ironed for hours. But then, sudden cracks expose rough fissures to the light of day. We dare to investigate this unexpected netherworld, winding down a snaky path to the canyon floor. In this secret lair, we discover a gentle stream and 6 not-so-wild turkeys. We settle into our assigned campsite to inhale the austere beauty of our warren, where the adobe red walls that surround us are infused with day's last sunlight. Come evening, the air reverberates with galloping stallions, patriotic songs, costumed pioneers, and spirited dancers as the outdoor drama unfolds. Then all is quiet, as the spellbound audience retreats to the solitude of individual campfires. We marvel that mere chance has brought us to this concealed treasure of the Texas plains. Next door in New Mexico, we go into Carlsbad Caverns. At first, all we see is darkness, but gradually we realize we are in a totally new, magical world. Going beyond the entrance of Carlsbad Caverns. At first, a generic gray hole, but then pearl, slate, ivory, silver, dove, and oyster emerge from the monochromatic scene. At first, piles of bland rock, but then a turreted castle and a precarious pancake stack appear next to Gandalf and a quartet of dwarves. Soon, despite the gloom, we discern soda straws and stalactites that droop like eve-dangling icicles, invisibly growing before our eyes. From the narrowest tunnel to the big room that echoes our wonder, the shapes that seemed amorphous and mundane explode into multichromatic diversity. At first, the stranger labeled as pale and ashy, but then, beneath the prosaic surface, layers of color and contour materialize into a panoply of personality. Next we move on to Mesa Verde, and we've just set up camp when some of the locals come to visit. Vacationing in someone else's backyard. At noon, a neighbor stops by to gaze fearlessly at our camping family. At 1, another accepts a square of bread, which he promptly takes to his wife. At 2, a delegation from the forest passes through on its way to the creek. At 3, 2 boisterous fellows madly cavort on our awning. Accustomed as we are to human company, we watch in wonder at mule deer, meadowlark, swallow, and squirrel, who have their own ideas of civilized living. We can't leave New Mexico without visiting the Taos Pueblo. This amazing 4 or 5 story adobe structure has housed Native Americans for centuries. We're going to stop first in the little silver and turquoise jewelry shop on the property. We meet the owner. He tells us he and his wife are 80 years old, and both of them have lived in the Pueblo all of their lives. Even today, if you want to visit your auntie who lives 1 story up, you must get out the outdoor ladder and climb up the steps to her level. The more we look at this structure, the more it seems like sacred space. Prayer at the Taos Pueblo, home of the Red Willow people. When I am old, let me bend like the red willow, slanting as the wind dictates. Let my waters run pure, untainted by complaint or bile. Let them flow clean from the sacred blue lake, deep in my Sangre de Cristo hills. May I speak in Tiwa words, as my weathered feet lead me in the repeating steps of our corn dance. May I reap the harvest of a life well watered, nurtured by waving grasses at water's edge. Make me one with Taos. Excuse me. Now we're going to head up to Montana. We're going to visit a Hutterite community. The Hutterites are an offshoot of the Mennonites, and they have created many small farming communes in the Pacific Northwest. Life in the commune is highly regulated. A person's responsibilities and privileges are mostly dependent on age and gender. For instance, when a woman reaches 45 years of age, she no longer has to do the heavy farm work. Instead, she has the easy job of taking care of everybody else's children. The men all wear black suits, white shirts, black hats. The women, and even little children, wear long dark blue skirts, white blouses, dark blue vests, and little white lace caps. The women never cut their hair. Instead, they form two long braids which they coil up and pin behind their ears. The children are taught by a public school teacher who comes on the property. She teaches them until they are 15, which is the legal age in Montana to leave school. I'm sure this life is very satisfying to most of the people living there, but imagine you are a 16-year-old girl who's been to market on Saturday mornings, and you've seen just enough of the outside world to want it all. That burning sensation. 16 years of they say yes, and 16 years of they say no course through my farm-bound arms as I hoe the beans. 10 years of German verbs before school, and 10 years of Bible verses after, and not even a diploma to show I'm meant for more than the plow. They say I'm in Montana, that I belong in this commune, but I could be on the moon, except there's no tranquil sea. I've learned my center, but I'm ignorant of the edges, and I'm bound to see that shining world just beyond the fence. I'll burn my long blue skirt and slip on hip-pucker jeans. As soon as I scrub down the kitchen, I'll snip off my long coiled braids and tie purple ribbons in my hair. As soon as I feed the ducks, I'll pack away my German and, like you know, jive. As soon as I shell the peas, I'll ride the back roads, my arm around a leather jacket pump. As soon as I dress little Aggie, world, I'm coming to see you. As soon as the sun burns green. Once we start traveling, we find out pretty soon that we don't have to go to a highly touted tourist attraction every single day. Sometimes just sitting on the porch rocker of the lodge that we're staying at and looking at everything around us gives us all the pleasure we need. Other times, just taking an aimless drive down back roads is a wonderful way to spend a day. The order of things. Montana's velveteen ridges etch themselves against the sky. They have pushed and shoved for position over a mountain of centuries. Now they stand firm, ready to defend their ground. In the prostrate valley below, we appear to head directly into the heights. But soon, like our companion Flathead River, we veer abruptly to run parallel with the barrier. We pass a dead silent lake with only its newly risen morning mist, a vague and shimmery fog of vapors, to verify its existence. Here, the natural world rules, and I can only kneel in its reigning presence. In 1804 and 5, Lewis and Clark and their companions took quite a trip. They traveled 8,000 miles over 28 months, mostly by boat and horseback. I find it really amazing to learn that they spent well over half their time in the place we now call Montana. One day when William Clark was in that area, he sized up a sandstone cliff and he named it Pompey's Pillar. He was naming it after the baby that Sacagawea had birthed during their trip. He called the baby Pom, or Pompey. And then he picked up a little rock and wrote his name and the date on the rock. That little piece of graffiti is the only on-site evidence we have of that whole expedition. Reinventing graffiti. Once graffiti was a crime, now it's a civic improvement project. Surprised felons are hired to paint abandoned factory walls. Their sanctioned mission attracting tourists and instilling pride in the locals. Could William Clark, of Lewis and Clark fame, have foreseen this remarkable turn of events when he scrawled his signature on Pompey's Pillar in 1804? Why did he take time from his 8,000-mile expedition to stop at a nondescript Montana rock to leave his mark? But don't we all want to leave a mark, legal or not, a piece of tangible evidence that commemorates our journey? Continuing west, we come to the powerful Columbia River. We might think of the Columbia as the border between Washington State and Oregon, but actually it starts in Canada and spends about half its time up there before flowing into the United States. For millennia, the Columbia ran free all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Then came people who wanted to harness its energy for irrigation and power. They built large dams like Grand Coulee to control the river. And it worked for them. But then about 10, 15 years ago, a series of torrential rains pelted the river basin, and the river spoke up. Columbia River revolt. Brawny, growling master of the chasm, who shouldered rocky carrion to each side, digging through this arid land, the rogue who dared defy dry desert rules. Selfishly, you guarded your channeled run, while cracked velvet pan of gold and tan defined the nearby rounded hills. Parched rises, crimped and folded on themselves. But crafty men, once squandering stolen bounty, now measure out each liquid liter, puncture your heaving sides to tap the magic of basic elements bound in watery form. Once the master, now the servant, you flowed to neatly planted orchards and plowed up fields, ensuring that their land may grow green with surfeits of apples, cherries, and wine fruit. Now you bow to their engineered commands, bound by abusive walls and demeaning sluices, cowering at traffic lights called stop, go, and slow. Still growling, shouldering, digging, but defied. Then, fueled by a thunder of tormenting rains, you churn through the closely regulated miles, till at Ocean's Gate you flood the delta land, serving notice that the master has returned. can insist that I never met a salmon I didn't like. That's not 100% right, but, you know, pretty close. So what better place than the icy waters of Washington State to have a poem about salmon? Life cycle. Unable to fight the rushing current, baby salmon float downriver, tail first. They land in briny estuaries where they learn to abide salt and develop hardy directional gills. Then they head into open seas, facing new challenges with youthful bravado, until one day, prompted by compelling aromas, they return to their birthplace, prepared to spawn and die. So we drift aimlessly into the world, down unknown streams, into foreign lands, flinging ourselves into new waters, learning new gestures and strokes, crashing and gliding into adulthood. At some unexpected moment, lured by distant sense of comfort food, we plot our family tree and travel back to the cradle, if only in memory. One of the rivers that flows into the Columbia is the Yakima. In the spring, when the snows melt off the Cascade Mountains, a trip down the Yakima can be a frisky adventure, I'm told. But we're going there at the end of summer when there's hardly a current to be seen or felt. Directions for a float down the Yakima. Leave your pickup on the gravel and fling your raft into place. Slip slide down the mud bank and somersault into the craft. Throw all control switches overboard and drown your cell phone. Prop your toes up and laze your shoulders down. Circle through submerged reeds and let imperceptible currents direct you. Curl beside the sharp-edged ledge and glide under willow fans. Act surprised and scared at ripples and swirl at random in their wake. Peer into the mini depths and talk to the ducks. Send your laughter floating on cool drafts and prickle your skin with sun. Drink your beer in languid sips and eat your grapes in slow-mo. Thank Lewis and Clark for showing the way and whisper them into secrecy. Now we'll cross the Columbia and go southwest a little bit to Portland, Oregon. The city of Portland has created a beautiful Chinese garden right downtown. It's in honor of their sister city, Suzhou. When the leaders of Suzhou learned that Portland was going to take on this project, they packed up a tea house, willow trees that had already been trained to lean so that when they were put by a lake, their branches would make lovely shadows on the water. They even packed up the little pebbles for the paths that we are going to walk on. In Portland's Chinese garden. In the garden of awakening orchids, a bee takes rest on a pale lotus, while we sit stock still beneath the willow that slants toward the shadowed lake. Buzzing to the moonlocking pavilion, the bee settles for now, while we walk the pebbly path, wordless in the presence of a poem. A sibilant swoop brings the bee to the crescent cloud stone, inscribed with friendship marks from sister city Suzhou. In this fragrant park, a dictionary of peaceful sounds and a thesaurus of silence, we find room for the bee and us. Continuing south, we come to the magnificent redwood forests. They form a narrow swath that runs parallel with the Pacific, and they are mixed in with Sitka spruce trees. For centuries, they managed their lives just fine. Then came World War I, and military leaders decided that they needed the lightweight Sitka wood for their new weapon of choice, the airplane. They brought in lumberjacks. These lumberjacks got hungry, very hungry. So the solution was they would clear cut an area, burn it, and then turn it into pasture. Then they'd bring in beef cattle to feed the lumberjacks. Property rights. It's possible to catalog the undergrowth, fairy lantern, wood sorrel, candy flower, sword fern, and trillium. Impossible to imagine anyone not looking skyward, captivated by the giant redwoods and spruce that line the Pacific coast. Here the surf roars to itself. Water-laden fog coats the terrain, and rain upon rain nurtures the trees. For millennia, these natural wonders regenerated themselves, sprouting from rough-edged stumps and wind-fallen trunks, free from human touch. Then came the World War, and the formula changed. Airplane frames demanded Sitka wood, and the first intrusion into pristine seclusion began. After a region was logged, it was burned and converted to grazing pastures. Soon immigrant cattle became dinner for lumberjacks. How convenient for everyone, except the true owners of the land. Well, we're near the water, so let's charter a boat and steam our way all the way up to Glacier Bay in Alaska. Just before we get there, we will pass a little coastal village where most of the residents are members of the Tlingit tribe. They live so close to the glacier that they can hear the ice cracking and calving before it tumbles into the sea. White noise. Where is it lurking, that precisely chiseled vibration that defines glacial shattering and warns of imminent calving? Our native tongue failing, we turn to the Tlingits, those who know their seasons by the sounds and sights of iced waters, seal whiskers, shifting shorelines. They comply terse as a solitary snowflake, white thunder, and the cracking glacier rumbles its name. Since we have a boat at our disposal, let's take a cruise down to Hawaii. When we get there, we're going to take the winding road up to a dormant volcano that has the musical name of Haleakala. Up. With a name that enchants, Haleakala invites us to climb to the dormant crater, 10,000 feet above the broad Pacific. At 2,000, we share the scene with cows who graze on succulent grasses, and we cheerfully share a rainbow. Soon we pass cyclists who have free-wheeled non-stop down the sinuous slope, their hair flying wild, their grin shouting success. At 4,000, we inhale sweet cedar and push through marshmallow clouds where we shiver ourselves into sweaters. Rising still, we put the mist below us, heading through crisp air that covers the rocky highlands where not even cactus would dare intrude. Finally, we crest the mammoth chasm and stare deep into its ashy gray soil, a pale remain of red-hot conflagrations. Here, so they say, the demigod Maui, observed that women craved more daylight hours to complete their onerous chores. Ever helpful, he rubbed the sun and forced it to prolong its shining rays, so all washing, weeding, and plowing could be completed. Imagining the fiery cauldron that once boiled explosively, and Maui's contribution to feminine quality of life, we feel two kinds of heat rising in our veins. We're going to finish today by taking a plane back east. When we get as far as the mountains, we look down and we Easterners see right away that there are no scarlet leaves from maple trees here, but the golden aspen puts on quite a show of its own. This is a little haiku poem, which is a 3-line nature poem that I hope describes our trip today. When the aspen quakes, not from breeze, but our words, a poem rustles in the woods. Thank you all for coming.